If I could get my slides up, that would be awesome. Thank you. So while we're doing this, I'll let you know that what I'm presenting today is actually a chapter from a larger book project that I've been working on. And my research has largely revolved around substance use and linkage to substance abuse care. And for the last several years, I've been studying methadone treatment or medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder in Ukraine. And so the book that I'm writing is largely about that, about the politics of those modes of care within the structure of the great global health apparatus. But also it links what I found to the discord and political events of the last several years, because as I was at Maidan and then as I was following things in Crimea and Donbass later, I came to realize that what I was talking about also really mattered. So primarily what I will be talking about today is here we go. What I call the addiction imaginary as a discursive tool, right? And so I want to highlight that what I'm presenting today is one of the only pieces of my research where people who use drugs do not have a voice, where they're not part of the conversation, and it's because what I'm talking about is what other people think of when you say drug user, right? So this is a sort of discourse that they're excluded from. So things like, I'm focusing on the fact that the public image of drug users is very often good to think with, so as part of the sort of political ideological vernacular in order to make claims about the state, citizenship, sovereignty, things like that. I argue also that medicalized concepts and identities native to the international global health apparatus, like addict, like person living with HIV, things like that, that those concepts graft onto pre-existing social discourses in each new cultural context, producing unique subjectivities and mechanisms of social distinction wherever they're deployed. So the ideas of global health, just as much as the technologies, the pharmaceuticals, the evidence-based practices, these are tools, and different people with different orientations to the world pick them up and use them in different ways. And finally, that because of this, public health programs frequently become caught up in social, political, and even military conflict. And I use the photo that you see here because this ticks a lot of the boxes in the North American sort of imagination of drug use and drug addiction, but it doesn't have to be so morose or morbid. When I talk about the addiction imaginary, I also mean things like this, like the Lasunka poppy seed flavored Eskimo bar that has an anti-drug message on it, as well as a syringe in case their anti-drug message wasn't like truly hitting the mark with the 5-year-olds that are buying their ice cream bar, right? So it's very, very pervasive in a lot of different ways that we look at the world. So by way of very brief theoretical overview, and I go into this in more detail in the paper, but the major questions that I'm asking are things like, what obligations does the state have towards its citizens, and who are those citizens in the first place, right? How do we talk about drug users in a way that answers these specific questions? Things like, what sorts of privileges or rights do citizens have as citizens, or as certain types of citizens, as citizens of Ukraine, as worthy citizens of Ukraine, as anti-citizens of Ukraine, and so on. Are these rights, privileges, and obligations equally distributed? And if not, who does the job of divvying them up and who benefits? And then finally, how do drug users come to be defined as an exceptional class? And this is a term from medical anthropology primarily, where we talk about a group of people. Often it's used to discuss HIV positive people in resource poor parts of the world as having a special identity, needing very special, exceptional treatment, exceptional programs, exceptional care, things like that. And the answers to all of these questions come back to basic ideological values about who good citizens are and how a strong and successful state should behave in caring for the enfranchised. So what I'm going to be talking about here is 2 examples, and I'm just going to be running through the highlights because the paper covers an awful lot of territory. But what I want to do is draw on some examples that can illustrate what the pre-Maidan discourses were, so that once we go into Maidan and start talking about that, which we won't get to, maybe we'll get to in the Q&A, that's the next chapter of the book, but to really show the basis of where all of those things came from. So the first thing that I talk about is a piece of legislation called Order 200. Now, even though the Global Fund, this international health group, completely pays for, up until today, completely pays for all methadone programs and MAT programs for substance users in Ukraine, although just a few weeks ago, they budgeted it for 2017, which is completely phenomenal and shocking. But it is still nevertheless the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Internal Affairs that lays out the normative regulations for providing these programs, right? And in 2012, they laid out a new law to regulate methadone care, and there were several extremely problematic elements in it that kind of give you a sense of how they are perceiving the problem that methadone is supposed to help with. So the first was that the decision to initiate medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, to any given patient requires the consensus of a commission of 3 narcologists, which is sort of silly on its face because when do you need 3 doctors to diagnose something or write a prescription? Also, the vast majority of Ukraine's geographic territory is a rural area where a single narcologist cares for a large catchment area, so where they are supposed to conjure up these other 2 narcologists to form a commission is an excellent question. There was a requirement that one must have at least 3 years of experience using illicit opioids to be eligible for MAT, which is also silly on its face because there is no chronological normalcy to the way people enter or exit crisis with different substances that are habit forming. This was the really big one that raised a lot of eyebrows, that one must present documentation of 2 failed attempts at non-medication assisted treatment, so detox, talking about it, going to group, things like that, in an oncology center within the past year to be eligible. So what happened immediately after this is the HIV/AIDS Alliance, the people who are the primary grant recipient for the Global Fund and keep these programs going, really started pushing back and lobbying. And a few things happened that were interesting. So when they began making their arguments to the Ministry of Health that this law needed to change, the arguments that they were making were primarily about citizens' rights. People who use drugs are people. People in Ukraine have a right to health. That's how this should be approached. And especially they said, in our view, in addition to the negative impact that this will have on so many programs, in its current form, this order can threaten Ukraine's international reputation as a state that supports human rights and fulfills international obligations. This is a lot of discourse about democracy. The Ministry of Health, to their credit, did sort of do their due diligence in responding, and they were willing to fiddle with a couple of the minor details that were really sort of inconsequential, but they stuck to their guns and came back with this sort of line. This is how they were, in addition to saying, well, this is what our narcological experts at the government say we should do, so who are we to argue? They made this sort of claim a lot, that the Ukraine State Service on HIV and other socially dangerous diseases, it's a real thing, it's a subcommittee in the Ministry of Health, has approached the matter of preparing and approving this order carefully. And aside from the interests of MIT patients, has also taken into account the rights of Ukrainian citizens who do not inject drugs. So the way that this is being conceived is you have citizens here, people who use drugs over here, these folks have interests, these folks have rights, and they are set up in opposition to one another. So they're being cast as a sort of anti-citizen. And this view is sort of validated by the rhetorical changes in how the alliance came back to them. They really quickly switched gears, seeing that people who use drugs are people is not an argument that was going to win anyone over, and they started changing their argument to an HIV containment strategy, right? And saying that treatment for opioid dependence or opioid use disorder is a really key part of HIV care, and we have a big HIV problem, and it became more about keeping it in and not having HIV go out into the rest of the population. And especially when they wrote to Yanukovych directly on the occasion of World AIDS Day, they said, quote, saving the lives and the health of the citizens should be a top priority for the government. And the definition of the word citizens in that letter was left, I think, rhetorically and intentionally ambiguous to try to have as much effect as possible. The other example I talk about in the chapter is this, the Internet Party of Ukraine. So people might be familiar with Darth Vader, this character. He kind of gained a lot of internet fame after Maidan, but they were very present before Maidan happened as well. And for those who aren't familiar, very briefly, this is a technically registered political party. This person has technically run for president of Ukraine, has technically run for the mayor of Kiev. I think it's more accurate to describe them as a performance art group of the absurd, with a sort of political bent, and registering as a political party just sort of lends an authenticity to their performance, right? But what many people do not know, who were not following these folks before Maidan, is that much of their public action before they were making incredible Cossack imagery videos and putting them on YouTube for his presidential bid was that the vast majority of their public actions revolved around drug use. And they were criticizing the government specifically for their failure to police drug use. And this was used as an index to point out how the government was failing, right? The government's job is to protect citizens from drug users. And by the fact that you're not policing it, you're failing as a state. And that was how that critique was formed. So some of these incidences were fairly benign. So this was a particular moment when Darth Vader, flanked by stormtroopers, walked up Khrushchevsky and demanded audience with Azarov and wanted to complain about how all the police in Odessa are complicit in the drug trade there. It's a terribly, terribly funny video. He stays in character the whole time with an incredible commitment. But in addition to that, they also took up activities that were much more violent and much more problematic in this way. And especially in Odessa in 2013, before Maidan really took off, they were staging multiple raids on places that they called drug dens in Odessa, taking angle grinders to bolts, storming the places, gas bombing the places, showing up with both stormtroopers and groups of people that in any other context we would probably readily call titushki. And when there were people gathering around, this would always create a large audience of bystanders. In all of the videos that are online, the bystanders are actually cheering them. Even children are like, go get the narkomani, go get them, and would complain to reporters that the police were protecting the drug users. And so, again, this became a way to criticize the government. So by way of conclusion, I argue a couple of things. So the biomedicalization of opioid dependence. By biomedicalization, we mean defining something as a disease, right? So if you make alcoholism a disease, alcoholism is not your fault, you're sick. It amoralizes the discourse around it. That's sort of part of the social function it does. So the biomedicalization of opioid dependence in Ukraine does not consistently or even often morally neutralize the social meanings of drug use. So it's a partial or fractured biomedicalization. It doesn't really translate or compute. It creates a subject position for drug users as patients that overlaps with and grafts onto pre-existing discourses of social exclusion that cast all drug users as dangerous creatures. So it creates the drug user category as a boundary object, which means that people are talking about the same thing. Ostensibly, they're using the same words, but they're not referring to the same ideas. And that this inadvertently reinforces the object definition of drug users as a threat to the body politic, right? So if the Alliance had continued on its these are patients, these are patients, these are patients sort of discourse, they would have continued to reinforce this is an exceptional, different, dangerous class. And it was, I think, very intelligent of them to switch gears. And this matters because these discourses circulate elsewhere. They circulated on Maidan, where anti-Maidaners were called narkomani. They circulated in the Russian media, where everyone at Maidan was called narkomani and said that they were, Viktor Ivanov, the head of the drug control service, was like, everyone here is high and in a completely psychologically abnormal state. It mattered in Crimea, where one of the first acts of sort of the enactment of Russian sovereignty was the shutting down of methadone programs and the theatrical burning of the leftover stocks of methadone. This is sovereignty with a purpose, right? The sovereign, by definition, cuts the population into different groups. And so they did that simply because they could, to prove that they could. And it also appears in the DNR, LNR areas where discourses around how drug users are complicit in the separatism and the war run strong. And lots of people helped me do this and gave me money to do it, and I'm grateful. So thank you.